good that we think about doomsday because it consolidates your thinking and it makes everything sort of hyper-real for a while. I can remember the Cuban Missile Crisis when I was 12, that Halloween weekend, and while we hung up our sheets for our garage Halloween spook house, we were all hugging each other and teary, and yet we were actually thinking, you know, the grown-ups are worried, but nothing's going to happen. And so I've kind of, like a lot of you, I guess, I've grown up with the nuclear threat, Cold War, and then Vietnam, and at some time I decided the best way to live in the world was to travel lightly and not have anything that you were afraid of losing, so that you could just be happy and not always live with this cloud of fear. And then I had children, which has got to be God's great, you know, worst little slap across the face, wake up, you don't know what fear is. So back in the 70s, my husband and my 2 kids, who were toddlers at the time, and I had a hankering to live in the country. We'd been living in the big town of Windsor where he taught. And we looked around for an old farmhouse we could fix up, and we found one. It was close enough to Whiteman that it had missile silos on 3 sides of it. And at that time, I was just starting out trying to cobble together a writing career, and I was selling a few things, little short stories, and selling magazine pieces, and some opinion pieces, and some personal experience pieces. And I've always thought that you write about what's in the stew right around you if you're writing short stuff like that. Whatever is on your mind all the time is what you should get down on the page. So I was driving by these missile silos to take my kids to school each day, and that was what was on my mind all the time. But I thought, I can't write about this because I'm not an aerospace engineer, I'm not a politician, I know nothing about why we need the silos. But then one day this analogy just dropped in my lap, and I wrote a short article that opened a lot of doors for me. And it's this, and I thought I'd read it because this is kind of a doomsday thinking piece. It's called, oh, the title's wrong on it. I sold this to I actually called it The Snake in the Hole, but I see they've got it, How to Be Neighbors with a Nuke. Sold it to a magazine called Salt, that's the Catholic Church's social action magazine. So I'm just going to read it really, it's short. There was a hole in the ceiling of the reptile house in the Kansas City Zoo, about 18 inches or so in diameter and maybe 6 inches deep. Thousands of zoo visitors pass under it weekly, though I don't suppose all of them look up and notice it there. My husband, unfortunately, did. "Hey, there's a snake up there," he said, craning his neck. "Right over your head. It's right over your head, really." "No," I whispered hoarsely through clenched teeth, hoping if there was a snake it couldn't see my lips move. "There couldn't be. It must be a stuffed snake or something." "No, honey, look, it's a real honest-to-goodness snake. Look, it's right above you, in that hole." I looked up. It was. A small boa constrictor was coiled in a cozy circle on a tiny ledge within the hole right over my head. It was perfectly at home up there, only its tongue was moving. "What?" I asked a nearby zoo attendant, my eyes wild and my tongue thick with fear. She must have been used to nearly incoherent reactions like mine because she answered immediately, "No worries." She laughed lightly, like Connie would do. Good. She laughed lightly. "You're silly to fret. He won't come down. He won't come down." Riding home that day, I had a million questions, most of them about gravity, hunger, and boredom. Weren't any or all of those things adequate to bring several feet of snake plopping down on someone's unsuspecting head? "But honey, you heard the attendant. That snake has been there for ages and has never once expressed the slightest interest in coming down," my husband tried to reason with me. I waited for the rest of his argument in vain. Doesn't it go without saying there's always a first time? Now, nobody likes to think about nuclear war, but I happen to drive by 3 missile silos when I take my kids to school each day. So I don't have much choice. It's like a snake hanging over my head. You'll get used to those silos, the real estate woman told us when we bought the house several years ago. The local people don't give them a second thought after a while. I nodded when she said that, but I had my doubts. And now, 5 years later, I finally realized I don't get used to them because I don't want to get used to them. That would be like inviting a notorious criminal to make himself comfortable in my home to share a meal with my family while he kept a gun pointed at my daughter. It would be like a betrayal of my kids, and all kids too, I think. Maybe the missiles have to be there for some reason I'm not wise enough to really understand, but I don't have to make them welcome. So I protest. And more important, I work for projects that I think promote justice in the world because I really think justice is what gives peace a chance. Of course, it's tempting to assume those nuclear devices will stay where they belong, buried many feet under the rocky Missouri soil and encased in tons of concrete. Don't worry, many well-intentioned people have assured me, they won't go up. Why? Because they never have? But you see, I can imagine it happening. I can imagine those missiles tracing a delicate white line across the blue Ozark skies as cows munch unconcernedly around the suddenly empty silos. I can imagine the horror of realizing I won't even have time to reach my children's school before answering missiles reach their mark. Our part of the state and the air base it contains, they say, will be a smoking crater. Knob Noster is listed on Time magazine's list of the 10 most heavily defended cities in the country. We went back to the Kansas City Zoo last summer, and guess what? The snake was no longer in his hole. The hole was round and sunny and perfectly empty. Now, as I see it, one of two things must have happened. Perhaps the attendants realized that a hole on a ceiling under which thousands of people walk is no place for a snake and removed him. Maybe they decided it wasn't worth putting up with the dozens of silly people like me who reacted with disgust and shock. Or maybe the snake fell. I couldn't bring myself to ask the attendant, but on the chance that my voice was one of those lifted with enough horror to oust that boa, I'm glad I didn't react with nonchalance when I saw him coiled above our heads. And by the way, when we were living in that farmhouse, we live out of near Max Creek sort of now, but I had my office out in the field in back, and when the silos were imploded, I felt it under my feet. I'll never forget that day. I felt the ground vibrate when the nuclear non-proliferation pacts were signed and they were imploded. So anyway, thank you.